In a large area of woodland south of the city of Ypres, the British Army spent 4 years of the Great War. Periods of long static warfare gave way to big battles. Here stood Plugstreet Wood. After quite a few weeks away from Flanders, from Belgium, we've returned to the battlefields near Ypres, and we're south of Ypres this week, near to the village of Ploegsteert, or Plugstreet as the British Tommy called it, and we're going to have a walk into the nearby area of woodland that dominates this part of the battlefield, Ploegsteert or Plugstreet Wood. Now, technically speaking, in terms of modern boundaries, we're not actually in Flanders. For most British soldiers who were here during the war, to them this would be Flanders. It was near to Ypres, it was in Belgium, and for as far as they were concerned, everywhere was Flanders. But we're actually in Wallonia, which is the French-speaking part of Belgium. We've just crossed the border. The border is up in the town of Messines, just up the road, just up the hill, really, from where we are this week. So we're not in the Flemish, strictly speaking, we're not in the Flemish area of Belgium. Now, I mention this because very often when I describe this area or post photographs of it onto social media like Twitter, I get told off by my very good friends in Wallonia Tourism for referring to it as Flanders when it's actually Wallonia. But it's part of this complex history of Belgium in many ways, that this country drawn together with two groups of people, the Dutch speakers, the Flemish, and the French speakers, the Wallonians. And it was a country drawn together as a consequence of the outcome, really, of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, a country that we tied ourselves to by guaranteeing its neutrality with the Treaty of London of 1839, and which, in a generation later, we would find ourselves being dragged into a global conflict to defend gallant little Belgium. So it plays a very, very heavy and important role in the history of Britain in the Great War. But where we are, where we're starting our walk in this episode, is outside the gates of a cemetery that's on the road running north from Plugstreet, from Ploegsteert, up towards Messines, in an area where there are in fact 3 separate burial grounds together and a very large memorial to the missing. And we're going to start off by looking at those before walking into and right into the area of the wood itself. As we go in through the gate of the cemetery, we see the cemetery name engraved on the wall at the back. This is Hyde Park Corner, in brackets, Royal Berks Cemetery. Now, the Royal Berks part of that refers to the Royal Berkshire Regiment, the 1st 4th Territorial Battalion of that regiment that served in this area in 1915. And we'll talk a little bit more about them and one of their officers who was the first burial here shortly. But the Hyde Park Corner bit refers to a road junction a little bit further up the road towards Messines, where the road goes off to the left towards a position and indeed a cemetery with the same name, Underhill Farm. And that takes you along the lower slopes of what's called Hill 63, another one of these numbered hills, 63 metres above sea level, thus the name. So it was a main route up towards the battlefield area. Units would come from villages behind the lines, underneath Hill 63, up to Hyde Park Corner, and there would be dumps close to Plugstreet Wood for supplies, food, ammunition, later in the war, bombs, hand grenades and so on, trench mortar ammunition, and that would then be taken by soldiers on foot up and into the wood and the positions beyond. So given the large number of units that passed through here during the Great War, Hyde Park Corner was a very, very common thoroughfare junction for them to pass through and part of their war experience. Less famous than Hellfire Corner just outside Ypres on the Menin Road, but nevertheless one that many, many soldiers knew during their period of service here. Now, as we walk into the cemetery, this is a cemetery where there's 81 British burials, 4 German, 1 Australian and 1 Canadian. One of the first graves that's quite apparent as you walk in is the grave of a German soldier. Now, why are Germans buried in British cemeteries? Well, there's a number of reasons, and 2 of those reasons are expressed in the burials here. Max Seller, whose grave that we're looking at, we'll talk about shortly, was a German soldier killed in our trenches and brought here for burial. So when Germans attacked our positions, he died in a trench raid, and left behind their dead, we didn't just toss them over the parapet. We respected the enemy and we respected their dead, and we gave them a proper burial as and when we could. So many German soldiers were brought back to places like this for burial. The other Germans who are buried here are men who died later on in the war when the German offensive in April of 1918, what we called the Battle of the Lys, swept through here. And the Germans in that period of the war used quite a few British cemeteries around Ypres to bury their own dead. You see this quite commonly in different locations. The other reason that we often find German burials in British cemeteries are in hospital locations. We had a podcast about Lissenherk some weeks ago, the big military cemetery near to the casualty clearing stations at Remy Siding at Popperinge. And again, wounded German soldiers would be picked up off the battlefield by our stretcher bearers, by men from the Royal Army Medical Corps, and taken back to our medical facilities for treatment in exactly the same way British soldiers were being treated for their wounds. And just like British soldiers, some Germans were so grievously wounded that they died of their wounds, and again they were buried in cemeteries close to these medical facilities. And at Lissenherk, I think as we mentioned in the podcast, there is a separate German plot where a lot of the Germans are buried apart from the British soldiers. And you can usually pick out the German burials in a British cemetery like this quite easily because they've got a different shape to the top of their headstone. Here in Belgium, the headstones of German soldiers are squared off, but it does mean that they are quite easy to spot. And like I say, walking in here, we immediately see the grave of Max Seller. Now, Max Seller was a Jewish officer. You'll see the Star of David that's now been added to his grave. And he was an officer in the 7th Bavarian Infantry Regiment. The Bavarian Army Corps served along the Messines Ridge for a big chunk of the First World War, from Witchart and Whitesheet up towards the middle part of the ridge, down through Messines and down to this sector here at Plugstreet. So a lot of Bavarian units were involved, and the Germans tended to keep their men in one sector rather than move them around a lot. And what that meant was that units defending the ground got to know their sector very well. They knew its strong points, they knew its weaknesses, and they had plenty of time in most cases to prepare their defences in case of an Allied attack, whether in the early part of the war along the Messines front that would have been French soldiers, and then later on, of course, British and Commonwealth troops. And by 1918, there were Americans involved. Men from the 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee Divisions were fighting not far away in the 4th Battle of Ypres in September of 1918 before they pulled out and went down to fight alongside the Australians on the Somme. So Max Seller, Jewish officer serving in the 7th Bavarian Infantry Regiment, was killed in a trench raid on the British lines on the 24th of June 1915. The unit defending those trenches was the King Edward's Horse, which was quite an unusual unit. It was raised during the war, and it was initially for men who were from Empire nations, Commonwealth nations as we'd call them now, who were in Britain and didn't want to go back to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa and enlist in their own forces. They wanted to join up straight away. And you see men from a lot of different nations joining this British Army regiment at that period. And interestingly, the War Office extended the idea to Empire nations to America as well. Now, obviously, America had not been part of the British Empire for quite some time by the time of the First World War. But Americans were able to enlist, and quite a few Americans did. I've got a really great first-hand account of the First World War that's called A New York Actor on the Western Front, and the author was just that, a New York actor who was on the stage in London when war broke out, was outraged that America had not entered the war, and he joined up and he served. So it was quite a multinational force, and one of the men serving in this unit was a sergeant major called Victor Rathbone, who, when he looked at the body of Max Seller, who'd been killed in trying to get into the British trenches on that attack, he saw that he was Jewish, and he got hold of a Jewish chaplain, and he made sure that Max Seller was given a proper burial in accordance to what his religious beliefs were. Rathbone felt invested in this because he too was Jewish, and he went a step further. He wanted to be able to notify the family of Max Seller that he died. So he placed an article in the Jewish Chronicle at the time notifying them that he died, and eventually this information did get back to the family. So it's one of these really nice, insightful stories into the camaraderie that soldiers of opposing sides often felt for each other, respecting each other's service and sacrifice. And many of the veterans that I interviewed back in the 80s had a great kinship, really, with the German soldier, because they knew on the other side of no man's land they were living in the same muddy ditches, the same snow, under the same rain, and under the same conditions. And it's a great contrast, really, to the generation of the Second World War. When I've taken today, as I'm recording this, it's the anniversary of the D-Day landings, and I'm thinking about many of the Second World War veterans that I've taken back to Normandy. And just the other day, I did a podcast about Italy for World War II Nation. And the men that I've taken back to those sort of battlefields from World War II really had no interest or any connection to the German soldier they were fighting against. They had nothing but hatred, really, for these men. And whereas British veterans from the Great War who went back to the battlefields in those last few decades when we had veterans would often want to go to a German cemetery to pay their respects to the sacrifice of the men on the other side, it's not the same with World War II. It's a very different war. It wasn't a war of annihilation in the West in the same way that it was in the East, but the dominant virtues of what the British soldier perceived the German soldier in World War II to be about was in great contrast to their perception of the German soldier in the trenches of the Great War. And you can never see any conflict in isolation, which is why occasionally in this podcast we dip into some aspects of the other war, the next war. Max Zeller was one of 12,000 Jews to die serving with the Imperial German Army in the Great War. And that was a sacrifice which, of course, many Germans a generation later in Nazi Germany did not want to recognise in any shape or form. And, of course, that figure of 12,000 is just men who died on the battlefield. On top of that are thousands and thousands of others who served. And when you look at the records of concentration camps in places like Auschwitz and Dachau, and you look at some of the files that they have on display in places like that, my eye always is drawn to a date of birth. And if they're of that generation, that German generation that would have marched to war in 1914, you know you're looking at a photograph of a man sent to a camp who a generation before had gone to fight for that country that was now condemning him. I suppose it is the terrible nature of that first half of the 20th century. We often refer to A.J.P. Taylor and his description of total war and the 20th century beginning on the 1st of July 1916 with all that killing on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and how killing on that industrial scale would very much characterise much of the rest of the 20th century. This is where we see how all of these wars and all of these periods somehow come together, standing at the grave of an officer like this. Sadly, when you look at the records of the Zeller family, so many of them died in the Holocaust, so their loss and their tragedy did not end here on the battlefields in Belgium. Walking down what is essentially the front row of the cemetery, we get to about halfway and we come to that very first burial here, which is Lieutenant Roland Poulton Palmer of the 1st 4th Battalion, the Royal Berkshire Regiment, who was killed by a sniper on the 4th of May 1915. He was an heir to the Huntley and Palmer biscuit fortune. In fact, the 1st 4th Royal Berkshires, recruited in Reading, where the Huntley and Palmer factory was, were often referred to as the Biscuit Boys, because many of them worked in that factory where the famous Huntley and Palmer biscuits were made. Palmer was an international rugby player and a great sportsman, a real star of his generation, one of those lost voices, those talents that was never fulfilled. And over the years, I've brought a lot of people here with an interest in sport who've wanted to see his grave. He's probably one of the most famous sportsmen to have died in the war in many respects. But I also once brought a ledger group here in which a chap wanted to see his grave because his father had been at school with Roland Poulton Palmer and they'd raced together on the sports field. He added that Poulton Palmer was the one that had always won, but nevertheless, for him, this was almost as good as standing on these battlefields alongside his father. Here was a man his father had known and had cherished and had regarded highly, And there he was, decades later, long after his father's death, standing here paying tribute to Roland and his comrades. As we walk up the row, we see quite a few men in this area of the cemetery from the Royal Fusiliers, and they have a B prefix in front of their regimental numbers. A lot of regiments use this in particular to distinguish certain types of battalions, particularly Kitchener's Army, New Army battalions, and in this case it refers to men from the 26th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, the Bankers Battalion, so the B is for bankers. Now this was not Cockney rhyming slang for what the rest of the army thought of them. They were men drawn from the banking industry, so from banks and from institutions involved in the process of banking. So it's a unit raised in London in 1914. And when we look at the whole plethora of different units that were in Kitchener's army, we know about Northern Powers battalions like those from where I live in Barnsley, or down the road in Sheffield, or across the Pennines in Accrington. But there were many units drawn from specific trades and occupations. So it just showed how diverse different parts of that new army, that army raised in 1914, were. And that brings us to the end of this row, where we find the grave of Rifleman Albert French. He was with the King's Royal Rifle Corps, and he died on the 15th of April 1916. Now, originally there was no age on his headstone here, but some years ago, back in the 80s, there was a Radio 4 broadcast about his letters, which had been found in a suitcase. And there were letters home, I think, to his sister. And listening to that broadcast was the then head of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who was so impressed with this young man that they felt his true age should be inscribed on the headstone. So they added his age either side of the cross, age 16. So he was a very young soldier. Now the headstone has now been replaced, so as is the norm, his age is now added after his date of death, which is a shame in some respects, because I quite liked seeing that unusual placement of the age, because it added to an aspect of the story. Albert French was one of many thousands of teenage Tommies. You may remember we had a trench chat with Richard Van Emden, who has been writing about this subject for many, many years. He's got a new edition of his book on teenage Tommies coming out fairly shortly, and he has found a staggering number of young men who served in that early period of the war who were underage. And when we look at teenage Tommies, there's quite a few different categories of them, really, because before the war you could join the army quite legitimately straight from school, which was the leaving age was 12. So you could be 12, left school, and you could go into a colliery, into a pit, or into a factory, or you could join the regular army as a boy soldier. And when you got to 16, you went from the rank of boy to private. But under the Army Act, you couldn't be sent overseas until you were 18 years old. So one of the veterans that I knew, and I've spoken about him quite a few times on this podcast, George Butler, he left home age 12, joined the regular army in Bury, he joined the Lancashire Fusiliers. He served as a boy soldier, did his training. When he got to 16, he was a private. He specialised as a machine gunner, and he was part of his battalion's machine gun section on the outbreak of the war. He was only 17 when the war broke out, so he was underage. He was held back by his battalion commander and wasn't sent overseas until 1915, when he, so desperate for men, they asked him to sign a waiver, and off he went, and he came across to Flanders and joined his battalion in the field. Still, technically, underage for active service on the Western Front. So he's one type of teenage Tommy, a legitimate one. And again, in territorial battalions, you could join at a young age as well. And although those youngsters were meant to be left at home when that territorial battalion went on active service, we can see from the records that that often wasn't the case. So when the war broke out, you had to be a minimum of 18 to enlist in the army. Now, that generation didn't carry the amount of paperwork that we do. And if you marched into a recruiting office and you said you were 18 and you looked 18, you were in. One of the veterans that I interviewed, he marched into a recruiting office in Scotland, and the sergeant major looked at him and he said, "How old are you, sonny?" And he said, "16, sir." He said, "Well, go outside and march around the block and come back in when you're 18. So as long as you said you were 18, you were in. And again, what Richard Van Emden has found through his research, and we can see by walking the cemeteries of the Great War and looking at photographs of men from that generation, thousands and thousands of these young men joined up. Now, although we look at them as children, because they're under 18, I don't think they looked at themselves as children. You've got to remember they left school at 12 and they could go and work in some of the hardest industries that Britain had. And I think their perception was that they were young men, not children. And that's a modern perception that we have looking at them from the distance of 100 years. They weren't there legitimately, and we can look at their young, unfulfilled lives and see it for the tragedy that it is. But I think we've got to look at it as well in the context of the times and what their status was in British society of 1914. The other type of teenage Tommy is the one when conscription was introduced in 1916, because in the latter part of the war you were conscripted at 18 and then sent overseas. So if you look at the cemeteries from the last 100 days of the war, particularly those on the battlefields of September, October and November of 1918, you see the cemeteries there populated, sadly, with the dead of that period, many of which are 18 and 19 years old. Men brought into the army, often into their local regiment, trained with a training reserve battalion, and then sent overseas with their county regiment, very often in a draft. And once they get to the base at places like Ypres or Hill Taps, they're then posted to whichever regiment needed them. And you can see one draft being sent to several different regiments. So that's how the whole infrastructure makeup of the army changed in terms of its where it was drawn from in that final phase of the war. And these were all young soldiers. Small amount of training, straight on active service. And when you look at some of the stories of these men, very often their wars were very, very short. They're shoved straight into the fighting of that final period of the war, which was very fierce and very bloody and very costly, and their life expectancy was very, very slim indeed. There's a couple of great books on this. Men of 18 in 1918 is one of them, and I'll put a link to that on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk. Now, the Berks Cemetery where we're standing was closed in June of 1916. I don't really know why. I don't think the area that it covered was particularly full, but a decision was made to build an extension, the Berks Cemetery extension, on the other side of the road. So as we're standing here at Albert French's grave and we turn round, we can see the Ploegsteert Memorial ahead of us. To the right of that is the Berks Cemetery extension. And we'll walk across, taking care on this busy road, over to the cemetery, and we'll go in there. This is a slightly larger cemetery. There's 295 British burials in here, 51 Australians, 45 New Zealanders and 3 Canadians. It was started by units of the 41st Division, which was a new army, Kitchener's Army Division, that had been raised in 1914 and 1915, but didn't come overseas until the early part of 1916. It was one of the last Kitchener's Army formations to come across to the Western Front, and it came here to Ploegsteert to do its training, as it were, in the trenches before it took part in the big battle, which would be the attack on the village of Flers on the 15th of September 1916 in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on the Somme. The cemetery remained in use until September of 1917, when a lot of different units used it for the burial of the dead. Not so much in big battles, but more in the day-to-day activities of trench warfare. And a lot of support units you'll see in here, gunners from the Royal Field Artillery, trench mortar men, Royal Engineers, and so on. The cemetery was then enlarged in 1931, so we're on one side of the Ploegsteert Memorial. On the other side of it is another plot, and that is the Rosenberg Chateau Cemetery plots. That cemetery was a cemetery that we'd intended to keep, to make permanent, but the landowner did not want burials on his ground, and he fought a bit of a battle with the Imperial War Graves Commission, and essentially they had to give way, and the cemetery was closed in 1931, and the graves were moved to here. It is the only cemetery that we lost, in inverted commas, so a cemetery that intended to make permanent, but through circumstance were forced to close and move the graves somewhere else. In that plot, from that original cemetery, there's 171 British, 145 Canadians, 126 Australians and 35 New Zealanders. So you'll see it's not an inconsequential burial ground. And many of the Canadians are from Holding the Messines Ridge in the years before the big battle there. The Australians from the period of the fighting there in June and July of 1917, before Australian troops moved up to take part in the fighting at Polygon Wood, for example, and the New Zealanders from the same sort of period. There are many stories in this cemetery, but the two graves that I often go and see as I come in here are two lads from Yorkshire, Len and Bill Crossley. They were brothers. If you look at their graves, they have consecutive numbers. They joined up on the same day. They went to France on the same day. They went into the trenches on the same day. And they were killed with the 21st Battalion King's Royal Rifle Corps, the Yeoman's Rifles, on the 30th of June 1916, the same day, probably by the same shell when they were holding the front line. The 21st King's Royal Rifle Corps, the Yeoman Rifles, was a farmers' pals battalion raised by Earl Feversham. And we did an episode about Fleurs called the Colonel's Field. He was killed in that battle there in September of 1916. And these two lads, the Crossley brothers, they were two lads who joined his battalion on the outbreak of war and had been with him almost from the very beginning. I like to think that given the sort of man he was and how invested he was in his own community, that he quite likely wrote the letter to their mother to tell her that both her boys had been killed, and what the sort of reception a letter like that must have done to her, we can only but imagine. I often say this on the podcast, but when you think of women like Mrs. Crossley, they were as much victims of the Great War as her two boys who lay here in Berks Cemetery Extension. Unlike them, their lives came to an abrupt end with one shell, and she had to live the rest of her life in the shadow, the legacy of their sacrifice. A hard legacy, a hard shadow to survive in for all those years. And I guess these are the sort of things we think of every time we stand in front of graves like this. And I wish I could say that two brothers being killed on the same day was a unique occurrence. Sadly, in the annals of the Great War, in the history of the British and Commonwealth forces just here on the Western Front, it was an all too common occurrence when you recruit battalions from the same area and large numbers of men who live together, join up together, fight together, sadly die together. Often that includes entire families, and the losses some families endured in the Great War really are almost beyond belief. Also amongst the burials in here is quite a large number of tunnellers, and this is a bit of ground absolutely dead flat, the flattest bit of this area really in many respects, aside from the rising bit of ground around Hill 63 and beyond that to the Messines Ridge. You wouldn't necessarily associate this as an area with tunnelling, but tunnelling companies, divisional mining companies, and then eventually tunnelling companies of the Royal Engineers operated in this sector from quite early on in the war. On the far side of Plugstreet Wood, there was a place called the Birdcage where tunnelling was very active, and mines were laid there for the Battle of Messines, not all of which were used. One of them went off in a thunderstorm in 1955 when lightning struck the ground and the charge beneath was detonated. But close to it, another unused charge, remained intact. So somewhere in that field is an unexploded mine from that period, one of many such charges that lay beneath the battlefields of the Great War, all part of that greater legacy of the war that continues to this day. So finally we get to the memorial that is now in front of us. This is the Ploegsteert Memorial. It's a memorial to the missing, so it commemorates soldiers who through the fortunes of war do not have a marked grave. They have no known grave. Now some of these men will be buried in cemeteries, so in both of these cemeteries here, there's a couple of unknown soldiers. Because these were front-line cemeteries, there's fewer unknowns compared to a post-war concentration cemetery. But if we went down the road, there's another cemetery called the Strand Cemetery. There's quite a few unknowns in there. Whoever they are, their names would be on this memorial to the missing. But very many of these men will still be out there on the battlefield. And in the last couple of decades, one of the archaeological groups that operates here in Wallonia around Plugstreet, they found the remains of several British soldiers from the First World War who were subsequently reburied, and previously their names had been listed on this memorial. It's one of the smaller memorials to the missing. It commemorates 11,447 British soldiers who died from October 1914 until the end of the war. It covers an area from the Belgian border up to the border of Flanders, so just south of Messines. So it covers this area of Wallonia and Plugstreet Wood, and then it covers a big area of northern France from the town of Armentières, home of the famous Mademoiselle from Armentières. It covers that area down towards Bois-Grenier and some of the Albers Ridge battlefields. And it then ends on the Laysbrook River, which is close to Neuve Chapelle, for example, where the Le Tourret Memorial slightly overlaps with it. And there are one or two men on here who probably should be on Le Tourret or the Luz Memorial, and likewise one or two men who are on those memorials who probably should be on here. This is not an uncommon part of the commemoration of the missing of the Great War. Where did they actually die, and which memorial should they be on? And when we look at the long lists of names on here, again, we've spoken about this quite a lot on the podcast. The missing was one of those terrible bitter pills of the First World War. These were men killed on the battlefield whose remains could not be, in many cases, recovered, and their families back home had to wait in agony until their deaths were properly confirmed. And with missing soldiers, there was always that hope that somehow, by some miracle, they had survived, that they were lost in a German hospital or a prisoner of war camp, having lost their memory, and they would somehow recover it and come home. But the truth was they were never coming home, that they were now on the battlefield somewhere, probably part of the battlefield, with a tremendous shell fire that took place on places like this during the Great War. And here, finally, with the construction of monuments like this was their sepulchre. This is where they would be remembered. And this, for the families of these men, was part, I guess, of the closure of losing these men. The nearly 11,500 names on here cover a big chunk of the war, but are dominated by specific periods of the conflict. So October and November 1914, very predominant amongst some of the names that are on here. That's when the British Army advanced from France into this area of Belgium, around Ploegsteert, and engaged the German army around Plugstreet and Plugstreet Wood, leading to a stop line and the digging in and the creation of trenches in this area, part of what you could describe as the First Battle of Ypres. Another date that the memorial really heavily commemorates is the 9th of May 1915, which was the day of the Battle of Albers Ridge. So the casualties suffered in the ground above Neuve Chapelle, so in places like Fromelles and Bois-Grenier, who were men killed in those areas on the 9th of May 1915 as part of that Battle of Albers Ridge, who do not have a known grave, are commemorated here. And that attack is a classic example of how these men end up on this memorial, because wave after wave went forward, wave after wave was cut down in no man's land, and the bodies lay out there for much of the rest of the war. When the Australians attacked at Fromelles in 1916, and that's a battlefield that we'll come back to look at properly in another podcast, but when the Australians attacked there and lost so many men in the assault there in July of 1916, there was a burial, contemporary burial at the time, on both sides, on the Australian side and on the German side, which eventually would lead to the creation of a new cemetery many, many years later with Pheasant Wood. That's another story for another day. But in the recovery of Australian remains out there in no man's land at Fromelles, they also found the bodies of men who died on the 9th of May 1915. So that date very much dominates this part of the history of this memorial. In theory, there's no men on here from the Battle of Messines, because the boundary line for this memorial is south of Messines. So the Australian and New Zealand soldiers who were fighting in that area of the battlefield, they are either commemorated on their own memorial, the New Zealand Memorial at Messines, or in the case of the Australians, their names are on the Menin Gates in Ypres. So the next big period of the war in which this memorial commemorates is April of 1918, with the Battle of the Lys, when the Germans swept through this area in their final offensive of the war and captured Ploegsteert, Ploegsteert Wood, Hill 63, and pushed way beyond that to the town of Balliol, which just beyond that the Germans were stopped in several places, one of which was the Hoogenakker Ridge, and Hutchinson's machine guns of the 33rd Battalion, the Machine Gun Corps, which we spoke about in the recent podcasts on the Vickers gun. Now again, we could fill an entire podcast with the stories of some of the men that are on here, but a couple that I always go and see, one of them is one of the recipients of the Victoria Cross who's commemorated on here, Sapper William Hackett, Billy Hackett. He was a tunneller serving the 254th Tunnelling Company of the Royal Engineers, and he got a posthumous Victoria Cross for his bravery at Givenchy in June of 1916, when the Germans blew a mine on the surface at Givenchy, and it shattered the tunnels, the British tunnels beneath the battlefield, and some of the miners got trapped, and Hackett stayed behind to look after the men, to make sure they were okay, and would not just give up on them. He could have got out, got to safety, but he refused to do so, because He was a tunneler and he wouldn't leave his mates behind. He was not a young man, he was in his 40s, and he came from Mexborough, which is a village not far from me here in South Yorkshire. It was a mining village, and he worked in Manvers Colliery, which is one of the biggest collieries in this area, very, very much an industrial scale colliery. Nothing left of it at all now, all of the buildings associated with it torn down after the mines closed in this area in the 1980s. All that remains of it, in fact, is the Manvers Colliery War Memorial, which is set in its own little park. It's in very good condition. A lot of the locals look after it, and they have services there on a regular basis. And William Hackett, with many other Manvers miners, are commemorated on that memorial. I'll put a picture of it on the podcast website so you can see what it looks like. There was also a memorial to Hackett on the town hall in Mexborough, and when that was closed some years ago, they moved it into the park near the Town War Memorial in Mexborough. And again, I'll put a picture of that because it's got quite a nice engraved Victoria Cross on it, and it commemorates him. And the street where he lived, his house is still there, and there's a plaque on his house now commemorating him. Hackett left behind a widow and children. His son went to work in the colliery as well, and unfortunately was run over by a coal truck that took his leg off, which meant that he could no longer work. And that family, as a consequence of the death of William Hackett on the battlefield at Givenchy and the injury to his son, was probably pretty much left destitute as a consequence of it. So a sad outcome for a family that had given so much, really, and a soldier that had been awarded the highest decoration for gallantry on the battlefield, the Victoria Cross. Now, we mentioned how some men commemorated on memorials like this shouldn't be on here, and one of those is Thomas Henry Bowley. Bowley was a second lieutenant in the 2nd Battalion, the Border Regiment. He was killed at a place called Cruiseek Hill on the 26th of October 1914 during what was part of the First Battle of Ypres. Now, many years ago, I knew his daughter, Violet Bowley, and when I went to see her the first time, she said, my father was killed in the First World War. He was killed at Ypres. He was buried in a trench with his men, and his name is on the men in gates. And I was about to go across to Flanders the following week. So I said, well, when I go over, I'll photograph his name for you. So I went to the men in gate and went to the Border Regiment panels. I thought, second lieutenant, not going to be too many problems finding him on here. And I looked, and he wasn't there. So I went to the registers of the men in gate, and he wasn't listed in the registers. So I walked down to Elverdinger Straat on the other side of St George's Memorial Church to the offices of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and they very kindly looked him up in their records. And it transpired that although he was a career soldier in the Border Regiment, he joined as a young soldier, had fought in the Boer War, and was a colour sergeant when the war broke out. He'd landed with his battalion at Zeebrugge on the 6th of October 1914, and in the march down from Zeebrugge to Flanders, he'd been commissioned in the field. But there were no vacancies in the Border Regiment, so he was commissioned instead in the Leicestershire Regiment. And on the day that he died, the 1st Battalion, the Leicesters, were near Armentières. And when it came to commemorating him, it looked on paper as if he died there. So his name was added to the Ploegsteert Memorial, not to the men in gate. So all the men who died alongside him and who had been buried alongside him in that trench, wherever that was and whoever they were, they will be on the men in gate, and his name is here. So I came down here for her, photographed his name. She was delighted to find out what had actually happened to him, and she very kindly gave me some of his material, some of the letters and photographs and paperwork to do with him. She had his memorial plaque, and she kept that because that was something very precious to her. She kept it by her bedside, and of course, like so many young girls of that generation, she lived in the shadow of having lost a father in the Great War. She wanted me one day to have the plaque, and it's taken a long time for that plaque to get back to me. Very kindly, thanks to Steve Law of Great War Medals, the plaque surfaced, and recently it came back to me. So I'm sitting here now alongside Thomas Henry Bowley's memorial plaque, and that sort of the circle of that story has come full circle, and the plaque is back with me after having last seen it quite a few decades ago now, back in the late 1980s. And whenever we get that chance to get across to the battlefields, Plugstreet Memorial is one place that I'll be going to pay my respects to Thomas Henry Bowley. So we'll leave the memorial now, walk onto the road, and we'll follow the path up. It's quite a busy road, so if you do ever walk this, you've got to take care. And just beyond the road junction of Hyde Park Corner, the road goes off to the left there, and the main road bends around to the right, heading towards Messines. A little bit further up on the right-hand side is the beginning of a pathway, and we'll take that pathway. It'll run parallel to Plugstreet Wood, and as we walk down here, you can begin to see what a large area of woodland this is. It's a massive wood, stretching from the area where we are now right across to the other side of the battlefield where the front lines were. We're effectively behind the British front line. It was on that eastern side of the wood, so beyond the treetops we can see across to our right, but also to our left, because the Germans were on the Messines Ridge looking down on us, and the line came down around and followed the contours of the lower slopes of the ridge around to the flatlands on that eastern side of Plugstreet Wood. So as we come along here, the Germans would have been both ahead of us, to the right of us, and to our left as well. So this is not an area that you'd walk around in daylight. You'd have utilised the communication trenches that were here. It's something that, of course, you would have approached, though, in the darkness. And there were ration tracks, routes up to the front line, very close to where we are. We'll continue along this track, running parallel to the wood, as I say. A track will go off to the right into the wood. We're going to come back to that. We'll follow it round the corner to a small military cemetery, and that'll be our next stop. We've now come into Mud Corner Cemetery, an unusual name for a cemetery, for sure, but when you come here outside of the main period of good weather, you can see what an apt name it is. When I first came to this cemetery, which was on my very first visit to the battlefields in 1982, we walked into Ploegsteert Wood, following pretty much part of the route that we're going to be using on this podcast. We came to this cemetery, and the school minibus parks up at Prowse Point, which is a little bit further up the track ahead of us, cemetery that we spoke about in another podcast. We then walked it for the rest of the way, and I remember this being a very, very muddy corner indeed, and it lives up to its name all these years later. This cemetery, unlike the other ones that we've looked at, which were cemeteries from the day-to-day activity of trench warfare, this is a battle cemetery, so it's a battlefield cemetery created after an attack. In this case, the Battle of Messines on the 7th of June 1917, when men from the New Zealand Division, their New Zealand Divisional Burial Officer, buried men on this location. So it's very much a cemetery dominated by New Zealand burials. It's on the join, really, between the New Zealand troops attacking Messines village itself and the Australian troops from 3rd Australian Division, commanded by General Monash, who attacked around Plugstreet Wood to the southern part of the Messines Ridge. There are 53 New Zealand burials in here, 31 Australians and 1 British soldier. So it's quite a small battlefield cemetery, and again, it's one of these ones that is a delight, if that's the right word to use, to come to sit here surrounded by nature. You're very much in the countryside here. A lot of people who come to the battlefields around Ypres say how developed it is, and it's not like going to Arras or the Somme. But you can come to places, particularly in this southern sector of the Ypres salient, come to places like this and really connect with the landscape and the nature on the landscape and how the cemeteries fit into that landscape in exactly the same way that you can do in other parts of the Western Front. Now, we spoke in Hyde Park Corner Cemetery about young soldiers, about teenage Tommies. At the other end of the extreme, you have older soldiers as well. And then, curiously, in this cemetery, there are 3 of them. Private Alex Mackenzie, who was 47. He'd served in the Auckland Regiment, and serving with him at the same time was Private David Cowie, who was 43. There's a 2nd Wellington Regiment man buried in here, Private Ed Beach, and he was 54 when he was killed. Now, all of these men died after the Battle of Messines, when the New Zealand Division held the line beyond Messines and on the far side of the Messines Ridge, and they brought their dead back here for burial. They were men who'd seen considerable service in New Zealand forces. Alex Mackenzie, for example, had served at Gallipoli, and he'd also fought in the Boer War. So we think of young men lying about their age, putting their age up to be able to join the forces in 1914. A lot of older men put boot polish in their grey hair and put their age down to join the forces as well. Now, by the end of the war, they were conscripting everybody from 18 to 55. but to have men in their 40s and 50s trying to join infantry battalions as volunteers, which these New Zealanders all were, that was quite a different prospect. So they must have looked a bit younger than their age, because being in your 40s and 50s then, not that long before, that had pretty much been the life expectancy for their parents and certainly their grandparents. So these old soldiers would have been just that, old to the sort of 19, 20-something soldiers who were serving in the ranks alongside them. They probably called them pops. But men in this sort of age bracket are not uncommon when you look around the cemeteries of the Great War, and particularly not uncommon amongst Commonwealth servicemen. When you look at men who are Australian, Canadian, South African, New Zealander, you do see men who are much older serving in the ranks of infantry battalions. So we'll bid farewell to the Anzacs, the older soldiers who were buried in here. We'll rejoin that path. We'll walk back round a little way to where we saw the track going off to the left into the wood, and we'll walk now into Plugstreet Wood. And as we follow this track in, we come into the main area of the woodland that we'll walk through. The wood, as I mentioned before, was a massive area of woodland, and it's pretty flat here. And if you look around the trees, particularly if you come here in the spring or the winter, when the undergrowth is lower, you'll see it's flat. There is the indentation of shell holes around the trees. Very few, I think, if any, of the trees in the wood that we see today date from the period of the First World War. It sat pretty much on the front line for the 4 years, and many of the trees were just reduced to matchsticks, really. So we can see the signs of some shell holes here, but what we can't see, really, are the signs of trenches, which in a wood is unusual. If you go to woods on the Somme, you can see the trenches amongst the trees. The difference in the landscape here, though, is what lies beneath that area of blue clay that doesn't allow the water to drain away. It pushes it up. So if you dig in, anything you dig will very, very quickly fill up with water. And when they came here in the autumn of 1914, there was little water. So when they dug in, it didn't appear that this would be a problem. But once the rains came, anything that they dug quickly filled up. So what happened here is very, very quickly in that late autumn into early winter of 1914, the trenches here became breastwork positions where they built them up above ground level. There was a little bit of indentation where a trench had been dug and duck boards, the walkway to enable you to walk along, but the trench was built up above ground level to create this breastwork. Not thick enough, as they found out, to stop bullets. Eventually these breastworks would get thicker and the positions would give more defence, but it was part of the landscape in and around Plugstreet Wood, and there were several lines of trenches that were part of the British line in this Plugstreet sector. The other feature of Plugstreet Wood was the trackways that ran through the wood itself. We're going to walk down where one of them ran, and the main one that ran through the wood itself was called the Strand Military Cemetery that we spoke about earlier, that is on the southwestern side of the wood, is named after that main walkway through the wood itself. So men coming up into the wood, up towards the breastwork positions, would walk along these trackways, which were built and repaired by pioneer units and Royal Engineer units to keep them in good condition, to allow the movement of men, material, equipment, ammunition, food, everything else. It was all part of the infrastructure on this part of the battlefield. As this was a static front for a long time, in addition to the breastworks and the trackways, quite a large number of British bunkers were built in and around the wood. And it's unusual because the British didn't tend to build these. Our offensive policy of attacking the enemy meant that we didn't want to stay still too long, so why build bunkers? But here, this was a realisation that this was a static front and bunkers were a necessity. Most of them, they're not defensive bunkers for machine guns or anything like that. They're headquarters or signals bunkers, and there's one that was built for stretcher bearers and still retains the fittings for which stretchers could be placed into. You can wander into the wood to see some of these, but you've got to be mindful there is hunting in the woods, and obviously you don't want to get caught in the line of fire of a group of Belgian hunters, and you've got to respect their right to do that. If we look at the chronology of the war in Plugstreet Wood, in 1914, as we mentioned, the British Army swept through here to try and stop the German advance, and they did on the eastern side, and that's when the front lines were formed, and the wood was then behind our line and part of our battlefield infrastructure. It then became a settled, quiet sector, in inverted commas, if any part of the Western Front was ever truly quiet. But what it effectively became in the eyes of the War Office of the British Expeditionary Force here on the Western Front was what was referred to as a nursery sector. So it was a part of the line with trenches and a battlefield where you could bring in units fresh from Britain who had done basic training there and then acclimatise them to the conditions, the day-to-day conditions of trench warfare. Not throw them straight into a battle, but put them into a quiet part of the line like this, and they can therefore understand what it meant to hold the line, take over a battalion, carry out raids, work on your frontline wire and your trenches, and not suffer undue casualties in the process. So this nursery sector, which was one of several such sectors along the Western Front, particularly in the area of the Forgotten Front, so from here down past Armentières down into northern France, this was a place where many, many units rotated through during the early period of their experience on the Western Front. Got to know the trenches in a place like this, and then moved off to fight a big battle. And the 41st Division, who we mentioned earlier, who started the extension to the cemetery near the Plugstreet Memorial, they were one such unit who came straight from England to here, went into the trenches here, pulled out after some months in this sector, and then went down to fight in the Battle of the Somme. So that's one example. 1917, things changed with the Battle of Messines. The Germans were pushed to the other side of the Messines Ridge, and this was then quite some way behind our lines. Artillery then moved into the area, dug fresh gun pits near here, and they operated in and around Plugstreet Wood. And then in 1918, it returned to being a battlefield area when the Germans swept through here in April during the Battle of the Lys and captured all this ground. And it was eventually retaken in September 1918 in the final phase of the war, when some of the Northern POWs battalions, famous for their fight at Serres on the Somme and at Ypres, which we covered in a recent podcast, they fought through this area in pushing the Germans back across this part of the Messines Ridge, across towards the border of France and Belgium beyond it. So it was an area fought over several times during the war, but for a big, long period of it, it was classic, static, attritional warfare, trench warfare, the day-to-day activities, rifle grenades, mortars, morning hate with shell fire, gas attacks, snipers, patrolling, wiring parties, trench raids, all of that, all part of the soldiers' experience here. And because so many units passed through here, many men who went on to become famous came through here as well. Just up the road, looking down onto Ploegsteert Wood in 1914, was a soldier in a Bavarian infantry unit, Adolf Hitler. And I don't think I need to introduce who he is or who he was on this podcast. Also serving here in 1914 with the London Rifle Brigade was Henry Williamson. Now, I've spoken about him several times on the podcast, and I do intend to do a separate podcast about his war and his writing on the war further down the line. But Williamson was here with the London Rifle Brigade, and he took part in the Christmas truce near Plugstreet in 1914. He was a territorial soldier, just an ordinary private, who worked in an insurance company before the war and came over with the battalion in November 1914, straight into the line here alongside regular soldiers, and then was here up until the early part of 1915 when he was sent home and he was eventually commissioned into the Bedfordshire Regiment. Williamson wrote a lot about his time here at Plugstreet in both some of his non-fiction accounts of the war and some of his fictional accounts. He wrote a 15-novel sequence called A Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight, and his book How Dear Is Life, which is the first of the 5 war novels in that sequence, covers this period of the war when he's here at Plugstreet. Williamson was most famous for his nature writing. He wrote Tarka the Otter, which won the Hawthornden Prize in 1928. And for Williamson, being in a wood like this, particularly in the early period of the war when the wood had not been shattered by all the bombardments that would come later, there was very much the sounds and the sight of nature around him. And again, when you read the accounts of men, they do talk about this. They didn't live in isolation with their eyes just focused on the war. This was a generation like Williamson that had grown up perhaps in the countryside and listened for birdsong and spotted birds in the trees or on the barbed wire and looked at the flowers that came up amongst the undergrowth in the disturbed ground where the trenches and the trackways and the breastworks had been dug. And that leads me on to 1915 and Roland Leighton, who was here with the Worcestershire Regiment, another territorial battalion of the Worcestershire Regiment. He was the fiancé of Vera Brittain, and she wrote about him in her memoirs Testament of Youth, which was turned into that famous BBC series in the 1980s, and most recently a film, both of which are highly recommended. And he saw the flowers grow up amongst the trees here, the violets from Plugstreet, and he wrote a poem about this, which he sent home to Vera. And when you read it, and I'll put a link to it on the podcast website, it gives an idea that there is some degree of normality in a place like this. And I suppose that was something for men like Roland to cling on to. He would then move down to the Somme, and in the lead up to Christmas 1915, while out on patrol in no man's land, he would be mortally wounded. And she was waiting back home for him to come home on leave, and sadly instead came a telegram that he died on the battlefield. It's one of the classic accounts of the First World War, really. She threw the rest of her life into the peace movement. She didn't believe that the sacrifice of young men was something that wasn't justified. She lost not only Roland, but her own brother and others from that generation who would never return. Moving on to 1916, two men came here who would go on to have parliamentary connections to British history. One of them was Winston Churchill. His unit, the Royal Scots Fusiliers, was on the far side of Plugstreet Wood. He'd been Lord of the Admiralty in 1914 and had resigned after the disastrous Gallipoli campaign and came out to France, where he was given a frontline command. Again, Winston Churchill is not someone that I really need to introduce on this podcast, but as he pulled out of this sector and was persuaded to go back home to rejoin the War Cabinet, the 21st King's Royal Rifle Corps, which the Crossley twins, who we saw in the cemetery, they moved into this sector, and amongst the ranks of that unit as an officer was Anthony Eden. He was the adjutant of the battalion. Alongside Earl Feversham bringing his battalion across to France, Anthony Eden was there as well, and he would go on to become Prime Minister at the time of the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. But in the 1930s, he was Foreign Secretary, and he went to Nazi Germany on many occasions and met Herr Hitler. So two men who'd fought on the same part of the Western Front ended up essentially on opposing sides a generation later. And I mention all these people because it is part of this crisscross. And if we add Montgomery into the mix, Bernard Montgomery, having served as an officer in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, wounded not far down the road at Methuen in 1914, but during the Battle of Messines he was in this sector as a staff officer. We can see how all these famous names from another war, the next war, had crisscrossed here through this part of the Western Front. Quite an extraordinary notion to entertain in many ways. But we'll continue with our walk into the wood, with the birds singing in the trees around us. At this time of the year we'll be hearing the chiff-chaff, and we'll get on to one of the main rides and walk across to the next cemetery that we'll visit, and that'll be our next stop. There are 3 military cemeteries in the wood here, and in that respect it makes it quite an unusual part of the British sector of the Western Front, where you can come into a wooded area like this and see that many burial grounds from the Great War. And they're connected by a long central ride that runs through the modern wood, in the same way that the trackways did that ran through the wood during the war itself. And we'll walk to the first of those cemeteries now, which is Toronto Avenue Cemetery. Now, despite its name, there is no Canadian connection here. There's no Canadian burials. It was named after a nearby trench which ran close to a position called the Moated Grange, which was a farm building with one of those typically Flanders Flemish moats around it that was very close to this part of the wood. There are 78 burials here, all of them Australian, so it's an Australian battlefield cemetery from the Battle of Messines in June of 1917. All of the men killed here died between the first day of the battle, the 7th of June, and the 10th of June, so in quite a narrow period of the conflict. And those who are buried in here are from a select group of battalions recruited in New South Wales, which were part of the 3rd Australian Division. This was the division then commanded by Monash. He was a divisional commander at this stage of the war. By 1918, as we explained in a recent podcast about the last digger action at Montbriand, he would go on to become the corps commander. He'd served at Gallipoli in 1915, then was given command of a division. He trained this division up in the UK. It was probably one of the most highly trained Australian divisions that came to the Western Front in terms of carrying out battles on the ground. And you see that being demonstrated really by the battles that they fight in their first few months. So here at Messines, around Ploegsteert in June of 1917, and then later in the Third Battle of Ypres with the attack on the Brunnseinde Ridge, both from a battlefield perspective, quite successful operations. The men buried here died in an area between a position known as Factory Farm, where on the 7th of June 1917, the first day of the Battle of Messines, one of the Messines mines was blown. Nearly 2 tons of ammonal explosive destroyed the German positions there, creating quite a substantial crater which is still there to this day. And then they were pushing on beyond that into the next line of German positions, and beyond that to the far side of the ridge. And most of the casualties suffered by the Australians, and this mirrored much of the experience at the Battle of Messines in 1917, most of the casualties suffered were not in actually capturing the ground. They went through those early series of German trenches in this area quite quickly. It was actually defending the ground that they'd captured. The Germans then counterattacked to try and push us back across the ridge, and that's where the bulk of the casualties were suffered. So some of these men were killed in capturing the ground in the first phase of the battle, and others holding that ground once it was taken. And the whole Battle of Messines was one of those pivotal moments in the Great War. So much change, and when you look at it from a distance of over 100 years, this was really the beginning of the end of the truly static war. The war became far more mobile. There were big battles yet to come, but the lines were to and fro in a way that they hadn't done in the preceding years over the course of the next year and a half leading up to the end of the conflict in 1918. So with thoughts of the diggers there, we'll return to that main ride and walk down the wood, and that'll bring us to our next cemetery, which is Ploegsteert Wood Military Cemetery. Now this is just to the right of the track where we are, set in this quite idyllic woodland glade really. And when we walk in through the main gate, we instantly see this is not a post-war cemetery, it's a wartime one, and we can see that by the irregular fashion in which the headstones within this cemetery are arranged. It's not neat rows and plots, it's individual little burial grounds that were created during the war. So this is a wartime cemetery, a comrade cemetery, where men from particular units are buried together. So within this, what we see are battalion burial plots. In total, there's 118 British burials in here, 28 Canadian, 18 New Zealand, 1 Australian, and of those, 2 are unknown soldiers. So the majority are known, so we know who these men are, which is quite interesting when we look at these battalion plots. It gives us a bit of an insight into the sort of men that were serving with those units during the periods of static warfare here in those early years of the First World War. In one plot, we see quite a lot of men from the 1st Battalion, the Somerset Light Infantry. Now, they are a unit particularly associated with Plugstreet Wood and the sector around Plugstreet. They were here from October 1914 on into early 1915, and then they moved further north to take part in the Second Battle of Ypres. Amongst those who served here with the battalion at that time was Bertie Prowse, for example. Prowse Point, just to the north of Plugstreet Wood, was named after him. He would go from company commander to battalion commander, and by the time of the Battle of the Somme, brigade commander. He was wounded in the fighting at Serres on the 1st of July and died of wounds that same day, becoming the most senior British officer, by then the rank of brigadier general, to die on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Serving alongside him here at Ploegsteert was another man whose journey would end at Serres on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and that was Lieutenant Val Braithwaite. Valentine Braithwaite was a young platoon commander here, one of the first men in the British Army to be awarded the Military Cross for his bravery here at Ploegsteert in December of 1914. His father was a senior officer. Now, we've mentioned both Val and his father in several podcasts in this series. His father was the commander of the 62nd West Riding Division during the winter of 1916-17 and commanded them both at Bullecourt and later on. And when his son was killed on the first day of the Somme, His father, a divisional commander, came up to the battlefield and searched it to see if he could find his son's grave. They'd served together the previous year because after Ploegstreet, Val Braithwaite got a job with his father as a staff officer at Gallipoli. So Val went from the mud here in Flanders, the trenches and the wooded glades of Plugstreet Wood, off to the heat and the sun of Gallipoli in 1915, and then returned to the Western Front in time for that fateful beginning of the Battle of the Somme in July of 1916. So their stories intermingle really with the men who never made it beyond Plugstreet, and one of those, a man that they would have known, is the medical officer of the battalion, Lieutenant J.R. Waddy MC, again one of the very earliest officers of the British Army to be awarded the Military Cross for bravery. He died at Plugstreet on the 17th of March 1915. And in the first year of the war, 1st Somerset's, I think, lost something like 3 medical officers. Waddy here at Plugstreet, and the man that replaced him was killed by a sniper in the attack on Fortin 17 at Bozinga, just north of Ypres, in July of 1915. The role of regimental medical officers like this man here was really quite a crucial one, to treat the wounded on the battlefield or in static positions like this, bring them into the regimental aid post for treatment. But they were men who risked their lives on a daily basis to go and recover the wounded, treat the wounded, and be exposed on a battlefield on such a regular basis that sadly all too often their life expectancy was just a short one. And really there is got to be a book one day from someone on the role and the lives and the experience of young medical officers like this, and their fate really, not just here on the Western Front, but on other battlefields of the Great War. As we look around, we can see other battalion plots. Plot 5 was a Bucks cemetery at one stage, and by Bucks we mean Buckinghamshire, because the Bucks battalion of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry served here in 1915, and some of their dead are buried in this plot. But there's also other battalion plots from the 1st 5th Gloucestershire Regiment and the 8th Battalion Law North Lancs. This type of burial ground, this type of comrade cemetery, is very common in France, in particular in places like the Somme or on the Hindenburg Line battlefields, or even in the 1918 battlefields. But here in Flanders, with a much greater concentration of graves after the war, these type of cemeteries are rarer or unusual, really. But they give us a greater insight into what types of cemeteries once existed on the whole battlefields around Ypres. And there were these plots that we could come to visit men from this regiment or that regiment, but most of those were closed and moved into the vast concentration cemeteries like Cement House or even Tyne Cot, of course. But I think that when you come to these small battalion-type burial grounds like this, and you can see how men took trouble to bury the dead, men who'd known each other, served alongside each other, slept on the same fire step, and they ended up being buried in the same plot of the same cemetery. There's something incredibly moving about that, and quite affecting when you come to sites like this. And we'll continue with our journey back onto the ride now, down to the far end and the final of the cemeteries that we'll see here in Plugstreet Wood, and that's Rifle House Cemetery. This really is a quiet and secluded cemetery. I'm going to come back and do a part 2 really to this podcast, because I need to come here with my field recorder and record the sounds of Plugstreet Wood, so you can truly appreciate what it is like to walk amongst these wooded glades here and amongst the cemeteries that lie beneath the canopy of this vast area of Flanders woodland. And here at Rifle House, named after a building close by, we find a slightly bigger cemetery than the other ones. There's 229 British burials in here and 1 Canadian. Of the total, 2 are unknown. So again, we know who most of these men are, and that gives us this greater insight into the men and their units and the backgrounds that the men had. And as we walk amongst them, we see battalion plots, a group of men from the 11th Battalion, the Cheshire Regiment, the battalion that would serve here in the early period of the war and then come back to fight here in the Battle of the Lys in April of 1918. Another plot from the 5th Royal Berkshires. And when we look at these battalion plots, very often it's in the very early phases of their experience on the Western Front, when mistakes are being made. Men expose themselves unnecessarily in the trenches and get killed by snipers or machine gun fire. Men get killed out on patrol or by casual shelling, which they're not used to. They can't quite read the battlefield at this stage. And we're seeing a battalion at the beginning of its war experience. Many of them had a long road and a long war ahead of them But it's interesting when you look at some of the battalion histories and the unit histories of units that came to places like this. Very often they focus on that early period, because these were the early enlistees who were buried in cemeteries like this, men who responded to the call when these battalions were first formed at the very beginning of the war. And perhaps the survivors looked back and thought perhaps these men were the best of them. Perhaps they too were the lucky ones who didn't see the killing grounds of Lewes, or the rolling downland of the Somme, or the muds of Passchendaele. And I guess again it's interesting to think about that as we wander around these graves. But as we walk into the middle of the cemetery, we spy a grave, another grave, with the Star of David on it, this one of a British soldier. And there's a nice bit of symmetry. We started with the grave of a Jewish German soldier, and here we are at the grave of a Jewish British soldier. Unlike Max Seller, the officer who died in the trench raid, the soldier buried here, this British soldier, is a young lad. Rifleman Robert Barnett was a regular soldier, a pre-war regular soldier, a boy soldier, in the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, and he was killed here on the 19th of December 1914, age 15. One of the youngest soldiers to die in Flanders during all 4 years of the First World War. From Stoke Newington in London, his young face stares back at us from the pages of the British Book of Jewry, which is the memorial book that they published that commemorates British Jews who had died in the First World War. And as we stand here looking into that image, with the birds singing above us in the trees of Plugstreet Wood, once more we have cause to reflect, to think, and wonder what next we'll find along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.